Angry Rhino spots woman who raised him after 7 years. What happens next is shocking. The acrid smell of burning sage drifted through the evening air as Rachel Carter adjusted her camera lens, her fingers trembling slightly against the weathered equipment. 7 years? 7 years since she'd last set foot on African soil, and yet the weight of her failure still pressed against her chest like a physical thing. The setting sun painted the savannah in brilliant oranges and deep purples, but she barely noticed the beauty anymore. Every sunset only reminded her of him. Of Tao. "Miss Wilson?" A gruff voice called out, using her cover name. "Your permits are cleared. Welcome to Ngala Reserve." Rachel turned to face the security guard, forcing her features into the practiced smile of Sarah Wilson, wildlife photographer and journalist. The lie felt bitter on her tongue, but it was necessary. "Thank you. I appreciate the late check-in." The guard, a stocky man with deep-set eyes, gave her camera equipment a cursory glance. "Just remember the rules. No wandering off the designated paths, no night photography without an escort, and absolutely no approaching the animals." He paused, his expression darkening. "Especially if you see the big one." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. "The big one?" "The phantom beast," the guard said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Biggest rhino anyone's ever seen. Mean as hell too. Finished 3 hunters last month alone." He spat on the ground. "Devil's got more lives than a cat, that one. Been shot at least a dozen times, but nothing brings him down." Rachel clutched her camera tighter, grateful for the growing darkness that hid her expression. "Sounds like quite the story," she managed to say. "Any chance I could get some photos of him?" The guard barked out a laugh. "Your funeral, lady. But Mr. Kane's orders are clear, any shots of that beast stay private. Bad for business, you understand." She nodded, already cataloging the name. Robert Kane, the man who'd bought Tao all those years ago. The man she'd spent years tracking down through shell companies and buried paperwork. As the guard walked away, Rachel allowed herself a moment to steady her breathing. The weight of her real equipment, hidden in a false bottom of her luggage, seemed to grow heavier. Micro cameras, GPS trackers, and enough recording equipment to expose every dark secret this private hunting reserve held. She made her way to her assigned cabin, mind racing with the guard's words. The phantom beast. Could it really be him? The thought that Tao might still be alive after all these years sent hope and dread coursing through her in equal measure. Inside the cabin, Rachel quickly swept for surveillance devices, finding 2, amateur work, easily disabled. Once secure, she pulled out her real notebook, the pages filled with years of investigation. Newspaper clippings about wealthy hunters mysteriously finside on safari. Satellite images showing mass graves just outside the reserve's boundaries. And at the center of it all, a photograph taken 7 years ago, a young Rachel kneeling beside a baby rhino, both of them innocent to the betrayal that awaited. The memory hit her like a physical blow. She'd raised Tao from the age of 2 weeks, after poachers had finished his mother. For 3 years she'd bottle-fed him, protected him, loved him like her own child. The local conservation center had been thrilled with his progress, right up until the day everything fell apart. She still remembered the morning she arrived to find his enclosure empty. The official story was that he'd been transferred to a larger reserve, but the truth had trickled out slowly, painfully. The center's director had sold him to the highest bidder, a private hunting reserve catering to wealthy clients who wanted guaranteed trophies. Rachel had fought, of course. Filed complaints, contacted authorities, even tried to break into the reserve herself. But money spoke louder than ethics in this part of the world, and eventually, she'd been forced to leave the country, her conservation license revoked. But she hadn't given up. She'd just gotten smarter. A distant roar pulled her from her thoughts, followed by shouts and the sound of engines revving. Rachel moved to the window, her heart pounding. In the distance, she could see vehicle lights moving frantically across the landscape, converging on a point just beyond her view. Without hesitation, she grabbed her gear. The guard's warnings echoed in her head, but she ignored them. She hadn't come this far to play by their rules. The African bush at night was a maze of shadows and sounds, but Rachel moved through it with practiced ease. The skills she'd learned as a conservationist had never left her. If anything, years of investigative journalism had only sharpened them. She followed the commotion, staying low and using the terrain for cover. The voices grew louder, more panicked. Through her night vision scope, she could make out 3 safari vehicles forming a loose triangle, their spotlights cutting through the darkness. And then she saw him. The breath left her lungs in a rush. The Rhino standing in the vehicle's crossbeams was massive, far larger than any she'd ever seen. His hide was a map of scars, some fresh, others long-healed. One horn was partially broken, giving him an even more fearsome appearance. But it was his eyes that froze her in place. Even at this distance, she could see the intelligence in them, the calculated fury. This was no mindless beast. This was a warrior who'd learned to fight back. "Tao," she whispered, and for a moment she was sure she saw his ear twitch. The spell broke as one of the vehicles gunned its engine, trying to force the Rhino to move. Instead of fleeing, however, the massive creature lowered his head and charged. What happened next would stay with Rachel forever. The Rhino moved with impossible precision, targeting the vehicle's weak points. One horn caught the undercarriage, flipping the heavy SUV like it was made of paper. The other vehicles tried to intervene, but they might as well have been trying to stop a tank. In less than a minute, it was over. 2 vehicles destroyed, the third retreating into the darkness. The hunters who could still move were running, leaving their wounded behind. And then, in the sudden silence, the Rhino turned to look directly at her hiding spot. Rachel's body screamed at her to run, but she stayed frozen, barely breathing. The massive creature took one step toward her, then another. At this distance, she could see every scar, every battle wound. How many times had they tried to finish him? How many hunters had he fought off? She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt tears running down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you." The Rhino stopped, his head tilting slightly. A hunter's flashlight, dropped in the chaos, illuminated his face, and Rachel gasped. There, just below his right ear, was a marking she'd know anywhere, a distinctive white patch in the shape of a crescent moon. She'd spent countless hours tracing that mark while bottle-feeding a baby rhino who'd lost everything. It was him. It was really him. A shot rang out, and Rachel instinctively ducked. One of the fallen hunters had regained consciousness, his rifle aimed at Tao's massive form. "No!" Rachel shouted, forgetting everything about staying hidden. "Tao, look out!" The Rhino reacted instantly to her voice, spinning with surprising agility. The bullet ricocheted off his armored hide, and before the hunter could chamber another round, Tao had closed the distance. Rachel looked away from what happened next. When she looked back, Tao was standing still, his breathing heavy but controlled. He turned back to her, and this time, she didn't feel any fear at all. Slowly, deliberately, he began to walk away from the carnage. After a few steps, he stopped and looked back at her, as if waiting. Rachel understood. After 7 years, hundreds of sleepless nights, and endless guilt, she was finally going to learn the truth. And Tao, the baby rhino she'd raised, now a scarred warrior, was going to show her. She took a deep breath and followed him into the darkness. Dawn broke over Ngala Reserve, painting the savanna in shades of gold and crimson. Rachel had spent the night tracking Tao through the bush, her heart pounding with every snapped twig and rustling leaf. The massive rhino moved with surprising stealth for his size, leading her deeper into restricted areas of the reserve. But as the sun climbed higher, something changed. Tao's demeanor shifted from purposeful to alert, his scarred ears twitching at some sound Rachel couldn't yet hear. Before she could react, he nudged her roughly toward a dense thicket of acacia trees. The message was clear: hide. Seconds later, the distant whump-whump of helicopter blades cut through the morning air. Rachel pressed herself deeper into the foliage, her camera ready. Through her lens, she watched as 3 heavily armed vehicles emerged from the tree line, followed by a sleek black helicopter hovering low over the canopy. "Target spotted!" A voice crackled over a radio. All units converge on Sector 7. Remember, the client paid for a clean shot. No tranks, no nets. Let's give him what he wants. Rachel's blood ran cold. They weren't here to capture Tao, they were here to finish him. The vehicles spread out in a practice formation, creating a kill zone in the open clearing ahead. From her hidden position, Rachel could see men with high-powered rifles taking up strategic positions. These weren't amateur hunters. They moved with military precision. Tao stood his ground in the clearing, his massive frame tense but unafraid. Rachel had seen that stance before, back when he was young and learning to face down predators. But there was something different now, a calculating intelligence in his eyes that sent chills down her spine. The helicopter swooped lower, and Rachel caught a glimpse of a man in expensive safari gear, a custom rifle resting across his knees. The client, she realized. Here to add another trophy to his collection. Beautiful beast. The man's voice carried over the radio. Biggest rhino I've ever seen. This will make quite the story at the club. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The vehicles began to close in, engines growling. Standard procedure would be for Tao to flee, to be herded toward the waiting client for an easy shot. Instead, he charged. The first vehicle barely had time to react. Tao's broken horn caught the undercarriage at the perfect angle, sending it rolling end over end. The second tried to swerve, but Tao was already moving, his massive bulk belying an almost feline agility. Metal screamed as his horn ripped through the door like tissue paper. What the hell? The client's voice crackled with panic. Take the shot! Take the shot! Bullets sparked off Tao's hide, but he seemed beyond pain, beyond fear. Rachel watched in awe as years of abuse and torment transformed into pure, focused rage. This wasn't just an animal defending itself, this was vengeance incarnate. The helicopter tried to gain altitude, but Tao had already disabled the ground team. Bodies lay scattered across the clearing, some moving, some terrifyingly still. The few conscious hunters were fleeing into the bush, all thoughts of their wealthy client forgotten. Then Tao did something that made Rachel's heart stop. He looked directly at her hiding spot, then at the helicopter, and back at her. The message in those ancient eyes was unmistakable. Watch this. With deliberate steps, he positioned himself near a fallen tree, its trunk creating a natural ramp. The helicopter pilot, focused on keeping his wealthy passenger safe, didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. Tao charged, his powerful legs propelling him up the makeshift ramp. For a moment, he seemed to hang in the air, defying gravity. His horn caught the helicopter's landing skid, yanking it off balance. The aircraft spun wildly before crashing into the canopy, its rotors tangling in the branches. The client tumbled out, his expensive safari gear now coated in dust and blood. His rifle lay just out of reach. As Tao approached him, the man began to sob. Please, he begged. I'll pay anything. Anything. Rachel couldn't help herself. He doesn't want your money, she said, stepping out of hiding. He wants you to feel what they all felt. The helplessness. The fear. The man's eyes widened with recognition. You're that conservationist. The one who raised him. My name is Rachel Carter, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. And you're trespassing on his land. A new sound cut through the tension, more vehicles approaching. The reserve security force, no doubt responding to the chaos. The client scrambled to his feet, limping toward the sound of rescue. Tao watched him go, but made no move to pursue. Instead, he turned to Rachel, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the rage in his eyes. Recognition. Memory. The baby rhino she'd bottle-fed was still in there, somewhere beneath the scars and fury. But before she could process this revelation, Tao's head snapped up, his ears pivoting toward a new threat. Rachel heard it too, a soft whimper coming from the direction of the reserve's main compound. Tao's rage returned instantly, his muscles tensing. Whatever was happening at the compound, it was clear he knew about it. Clear that it was the real reason he brought her here. Show me, Rachel whispered, Without hesitation, Tao began moving through the bush, his path deliberate and focused. Rachel followed, her mind racing. What else was happening in this reserve? What other horrors had Tao witnessed during his years of captivity? As they crested a small rise, the answer began to emerge. In the distance, partially hidden by a stand of fever trees, stood a series of concrete bunkers. They weren't on any of the reserve's official maps. The whimpering grew louder, accompanied by the clank of heavy chains. Rachel's hands tightened on her camera. Whatever dark secrets this place held, she and Tao were about to expose them all. And judging by the look in Tao's eyes, the real revenge was just beginning. The concrete bunkers loomed before them, their weathered walls telling stories of suffering that made Rachel's stomach turn. As they drew closer, the whimpering grew more distinct, definitely a young rhino, and definitely in distress. Tao moved with practiced stealth, leading Rachel around security cameras and motion sensors. She realized with a chill that he must have spent years studying the compound's defenses, learning its weaknesses. This wasn't just his prison, it was his classroom. The first bunker door hung slightly ajar, its heavy metal frame scarred by what looked like horn marks. Inside, Rachel's night vision camera revealed a nightmare. Shelves lined with animal trophies stretched into the darkness, horns, tusks, pelts, all carefully catalogued and labeled with dates and client names. But it was the ledger lying open on a nearby desk that made her blood boil. Each entry detailed an animal's acquisition and subsequent sale to wealthy clients. The prices made her dizzy, hundreds of thousands of dollars for guaranteed kills, millions for endangered species. A sudden noise made her freeze. Tao, however, seemed to have expected it. He nudged her toward a stack of crates just as flashlight beams cut through the darkness. "Kane wants the new Rhino prepped for tomorrow's hunt," a gruff voice said. "Trank it if you have to, but make sure it's in the killing zone by dawn." "What about the Phantom?" another voice asked. "He's been shadowing the compound all week. Martinez's team just got taken out trying to corner him." A harsh laugh. "Let him come. Kane's got something special planned for that one. About time we ended this little vendetta." The voices faded, but Rachel barely noticed. Her mind was stuck on their words. Tomorrow's hunt. They were planning to finish another rhino, a young one, by the sound of its cries. She turned to share her horror with Tao, only to find him already moving toward the second bunker. His movements had changed, becoming more urgent. Whatever was in there, he knew about it. The smell hit her before the sight did. Death, old and new, lay thick in the air. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, shapes began to emerge from the shadows. Mounds of earth, too uniform to be natural. Tarps covering irregular forms. And bones, so many bones. "Oh God," Rachel whispered, her camera clicking rapidly despite her shaking hands. This wasn't just a hunting reserve. This was a slaughterhouse. She began documenting everything, her journalist's training taking over. The mass graves were arranged by date, each one corresponding to entries in the ledger she'd found. Some kills were legal, documented with permits and paperwork. But others. A familiar name caught her eye on one of the markers. Her heart stopped. "Themba," she breathed. Themba had been another rhino at her conservation center, taken the same day as Tao. She'd always wondered what happened to him. Now she knew. Tao made a low sound, almost like a moan. He'd known Themba too, had grown up with him. How many others had he watched die here? The click of a safety being released cut through her thoughts. "I was wondering when you'd find this place," a cultured voice said from the shadows. "Though I must admit, I expected you years ago." Rachel turned slowly, her hands raised. A man stepped into the dim light, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of tan that spoke of years in the African sun. She recognized him from her research, Robert Kane, owner of Gala Reserve. "Rachel Carter," he said, as if greeting an old friend. "The passionate conservationist who just couldn't let go. Do you know how much trouble your pet rhino has caused me over the years?" "Not enough," Rachel spat. Kane's smile didn't waver. "Always so righteous. But let's be honest, You're just as responsible for all this as I am. After all, you're the one who made him special. You're the one who taught him to trust humans." His smile turned cruel. "Made it so much easier to trap him that first time." The words hit Rachel like physical blows. Every doubt, every guilt-ridden night came rushing back. She had made Tao trust humans. Her love had made him vulnerable. "But I have to thank you," Cain continued, gesturing to the graves around them. "Your training made him quite the attraction. The rhino who thinks he's human. The beast with a vendetta. Do you know how much people will pay to hunt something like that?" The ground trembled slightly. Cain's smile widened. "Oh yes, he's out there. Watching. He always watches. But he won't intervene, not with a gun to your head. That's the problem with making animals too human, Miss Carter. They develop attachments." As if to punctuate his words, the young rhino's cries echoed through the compound again. Cain's eyes gleamed. "Tomorrow's client paid $2 million for a guaranteed kill. The youngest rhino we've had in years. Pure profit, since we didn't have to pay any bribes for this one. It wandered right into our territory." He checked his watch. "The hunt starts at dawn. Perhaps you'd like to watch? For old time's sake?" Rachel's mind raced. She could see Tao's massive shape moving in the darkness beyond the bunker's entrance. But Cain was right. As long as he had a gun to her head, Tao wouldn't risk charging in. But Cain had made one crucial mistake. He thought Tao's human traits were a weakness. Rachel knew better. "You're right," she said quietly. "I did teach Tao to trust humans. But I also taught him something else." She took a deep breath. "I taught him to protect others." Cain frowned. "What are you, Dash?" Rachel dropped to the ground just as Tao's roar shook the bunker, not from the entrance where Cain was watching, but from the back wall. Years of rage and calculating intelligence had taught him to think like a predator. While Cain was focused on the obvious threat, Tao had circled around. The wall exploded inward as nearly 3 tons of furious rhino burst through the concrete. Cain's gun went off, the shot going wild as he was showered with debris. He tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Tao advanced slowly, his massive head lowered. Every scar on his hide seemed to glow in the dim light, testament to years of abuse, years of waiting for this moment. But before he could reach Cain, a new sound cut through the chaos. "Engines. Lots of them." "You're too late." Cain laughed, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "The night shift is changing. 30 armed guards about to arrive. Even your pet monster can't fight those odds." He was right. Rachel could hear vehicles approaching from multiple directions. But then she heard something else, something that made her smile. The thunder of hooves. The trumpeting of elephants. The roars of lions. Tao wasn't alone anymore. The animals of Gala Reserve, driven by years of hunting and abuse, had finally had enough. Led by Tao's example, they were rising up against their tormentors. Cain's face went pale as he realized what was happening. "That's impossible," he whispered. "They're just animals." "No," Rachel said, picking up his dropped gun. "They're survivors. And they've been waiting for this moment just as long as Tao has." As if in response, the young rhino's cries turned into a roar of its own, a battle cry, not a whimper. The revolution had begun. And in Tao's eyes, Rachel saw not just rage now, but triumph. The revenge he planned for so long was finally at hand, and it would shake Ngala Reserve to its very foundations. Chaos erupted across Ngala Reserve as nature itself seemed to rise up against its tormentors. The night air filled with a symphony of roars, trumpeting, and thundering hooves as animals emerged from the darkness. Rachel watched in awe as elephants tore through electric fences like they were made of spider webs, while lions strategically herded panicking guards away from their vehicles. Tao stood in the center of it all, a general surveying his army. Years of watching, waiting, and planning had led to this moment. He'd learned the guards' patrol patterns, the weaknesses in the fences, and most importantly, he'd somehow communicated his knowledge to the other animals. Cain scrambled backward, his composure finally cracking. "This is insane. They're coordinating. They can't be coordinating. You watched Tao hunt your men for years, Rachel said, keeping the gun trained on him while documenting everything with her camera. Did you really think he was working alone all this time? A massive bull elephant smashed through the bunker's remaining wall, its tusks gleaming in the emergency lights that had started flashing across the compound. Rachel recognized him, one of the reserve's oldest residents, his tusks partially cut down from a previous hunting accident. The elephant's small eyes focused on Kane with unmistakable recognition. The reserve owner turned even paler. Maxwell, he whispered. The client paid triple for a guaranteed kill. I had no choice. The elephant trumpeted in response, the sound so loud it made the ground shake. But before he could reach Kane, Tao stepped between them. This was his fight. Rachel understood. The others are here for backup, she said. But Kane is yours. Gunfire erupted from the direction of the main compound. The guards were regrouping, trying to maintain some semblance of control. But they were used to hunting animals that fled from humans. These creatures had learned from Tao, they were hunting back. A young lion sprinted past the bunker entrance, carrying what looked like a rifle in its mouth. Behind it, Rachel could hear guards cursing. She had to smile. The animals weren't just fighting, they were disarming their opponents. The helicopter, Kane suddenly shouted into a radio he'd pulled from his jacket. Get the damn helicopter in the air! Use the tranq guns, shoot everything that moves! Rachel's blood ran cold. A helicopter with trained shooters could turn the tide, especially with tranquilizer darts that could drop even the largest animals. But Tao had planned for this too. A sound cut through the chaos, the distinctive cry of an African fish eagle. Rachel looked up to see dozens of birds diving through the darkness, their talons extended. They swarmed the helicopter pad, attacking anyone who tried to approach the aircraft. Your backup isn't coming, Rachel said. Tao didn't just unite the mammals, he got the birds on his side too. Kane lunged for her gun, desperation making him bold. Rachel sidestepped, bringing the butt of the rifle down on his shoulder. He stumbled but kept moving, running toward a hidden door in the bunker's floor. Emergency tunnel, he gasped. Leads to the airstrip. You can't stop all of us. Tao charged, but Kane had already disappeared down the hatch. The Rhino's massive bulk couldn't follow through the narrow opening. Rachel could see the fury building in Tao's eyes. After all these years, Kane was escaping. But then something changed in his expression. A familiar look that Rachel remembered from his youth, when he'd figured out a particularly challenging puzzle in his enclosure. Without warning, Tao turned and charged out of the bunker, heading toward the main compound. He knows where the tunnel ends, Rachel realized. She quickly sent a group of approaching lions toward the airstrip with a few sharp whistles, another skill from her conservation days that was proving unexpectedly useful. The scene outside the bunker was like something out of a fever dream. Giraffes were using their height to spot guards trying to hide in the bush, while zebras ran interference, their stripes confusing night vision equipment. Even the smaller animals were helping. Monkeys threw stones at guards with surprising accuracy, while warthogs sabotaged vehicle tires. Rachel ran after Tao, documenting everything with her camera. The world needed to see this, needed to understand that these weren't just dumb beasts to be hunted for sport. These were thinking, feeling creatures capable of remembering both kindness and cruelty. They reached the airstrip just as Kane emerged from the tunnel's other end. He was already running toward a small plane, its engine roaring to life. Start the upload, he shouted into his radio. Erase everything. If those photos get out dash. He never finished the sentence. Tao, timing his charge perfectly, caught the plane's wing just as it started to turn. Metal screamed as 3 tons of furious Rhino tore through it like paper. The plane spun, slamming back to Earth. Kane tumbled out, his expensive clothes now coated in dirt and hydraulic fluid. He tried to stand but fell back with a cry of pain. His leg was badly twisted. Tao advanced slowly, deliberately. Around them, the sounds of chaos were dying down. The guards had either fled or been subdued. The animals of Gala Reserve gathered in a loose circle, watching their champion face their tormentor. Wait! Cain held up his hands. Think about this. You're not a dumb beast, I know that better than anyone. I can make you rich. We can work together. Tao stopped mere inches from Cain, his massive head lowered, his horn gleaming in the aircraft's dying lights. He doesn't want your money, Rachel said, stepping forward with her camera raised. He wants exactly what you taught him to want, revenge. Fear finally broke through Cain's facade. Please, he begged. I'll confess to everything. I'll go to prison. Just don't let him finish me. Rachel looked at Tao, seeing not just the scarred warrior, but the baby rhino she'd raised. The one who'd learned to trust, to love, and yes, to hate. That's not my decision to make, she said quietly. You made him what he is. Now you have to face what you created. Tao's muscles tensed, ready for the final charge. Cain closed his eyes, waiting for the end. But the finishing blow never came. Instead, Tao turned away, leaving Cain sobbing in the dirt. He walked to Rachel's side, his message clear. There had been enough death in this place. The sound of sirens pierced the night. Rachel's contacts in the media and law enforcement had finally arrived. Soon, the world would know everything about Ngala Reserve. Cain's sobs turned to hysterical laughter. You think this changes anything? People will still pay to hunt. There will always be other reserves. Rachel scratched behind Tao's ears, just like she used to when he was small. Maybe, she said. But thanks to you, the animals have learned to fight back. And they'll teach others. As if in response, the young rhino they'd saved emerged from the darkness, walking straight to Tao's side. All around them, animals began to melt back into the bush. Their work here was done. Cain's empire was finished, but something new had been born in its place. Something that would change the relationship between humans and animals forever. The revenge was complete. Now it was time for revolution. Dawn broke over Ngala Reserve, painting the aftermath in harsh relief. Emergency vehicles surrounded the compound, their lights reflecting off the broken glass and twisted metal that littered the grounds. Rachel stood with the police commissioner, her camera's memory cards safely copied and distributed to multiple news agencies. There would be no covering this up. It's unprecedented, the commissioner said, shaking his head as he reviewed her evidence. Private hunting reserves are one thing, but this. He gestured to the mass graves they'd uncovered. This is industrial-scale poaching. Rachel watched as forensics teams tagged and photographed everything. The ledgers she'd discovered provided a roadmap to years of illegal hunting, connecting Cain to some of the most powerful people in the world. Names of politicians, business tycoons, and celebrities filled the books, all of them complicit in the slaughter. But something wasn't right. Cain, handcuffed and being treated by paramedics, was smiling. You're awfully calm for someone facing multiple life sentences, Rachel said, approaching him. Life is full of surprises, Cain replied, his composure restored now that death wasn't imminent. Like your remarkable rhino. Did you know we studied him? Tried to understand what made him different. His smile widened. We learned so much. A chill ran down Rachel's spine. What are you talking about? Check the lower labs, Cain said. The ones not in the official blueprints. Your little revolution missed something important. Rachel's instincts screamed a warning. She turned to find Tao, who had been watching the proceedings from a safe distance, but he was already moving. He'd heard every word, and the urgency in his stride told her Cain wasn't bluffing. Commissioner! Rachel called out. We need to dash. An explosion rocked the compound. Smoke billowed from a previously hidden entrance near the main building. Guards who had appeared to surrender suddenly produced hidden weapons, creating chaos in the police ranks. Did you really think I'd keep all my valuable assets in one place? Cain laughed. Emergency protocol. If the main facility is compromised, eliminate all evidence, including the specimens. Rachel ran after Tao, who was already charging toward the smoke. The hidden entrance led to a sterile laboratory complex that looked more like a military installation than a hunting reserve. Through the thickening smoke, She could make out rows of cages. Most were empty, their occupants likely finished in the initial explosion. But one reinforced cell still stood intact, and the sounds coming from it made Rachel's blood run cold. Inside was a rhino, but not like any she'd ever seen. Its hide was covered in mechanical augmentations, crude attempts to replicate Tao's extraordinary abilities through technology and surgery. "They were trying to make more like you," Rachel whispered in horror. "They were experimenting." The mutilated rhino charged its cage walls with desperate strength. The explosion had damaged the cell's locking mechanism, and each impact made the metal groan. If it broke free in this state of panic and pain, it would fincy everything in its path. Tao moved forward, positioning himself directly in front of the cage. The modified rhino stopped its assault, focusing on this new presence. Rachel held her breath. Two of the most powerful creatures she'd ever encountered, facing each other in the smoke-filled corridor. Then Tao did something unexpected. He lowered his head, not in submission or threat, but in recognition. A low rumble emanated from his throat, the same sound he used to make as a calf when he was frightened and seeking comfort. The modified rhino's mechanical implants sparked and whined, but its organic eye fixed on Tao. Slowly, incredibly, it began to calm. "They're connected," Rachel realized. Everything they did to try to replicate Tao just proved what made him special wasn't something you could engineer. It was about consciousness. Empathy. The very things Cain refused to believe animals possessed. The smoke was getting thicker. The facility's support structures, damaged by the explosion, were beginning to fail. "We need to get them out of here," Rachel shouted to the rescue teams that had followed them down. "Both of them." But before they could act, a shot rang out. Rachel spun to see Cain, somehow free of his restraints, holding a guard's rifle. "If I'm going down," he snarled, "I'm taking my greatest creation with me." The bullet struck Tao's flank, but instead of falling, he charged. Cain fired again and again, each shot finding its mark but failing to stop the rhino's advance. It was like watching a force of nature, unstoppable, inevitable. The modified rhino, witnessing Tao's protection, began ramming its cage with renewed purpose. This time, the weakened metal gave way. Cain's eyes widened as he found himself facing not one, but two enraged rhinos. He turned to run, only to find his escape blocked by the arriving police tactical team. "Drop the weapon!" the commissioner ordered. "It's over, Cain!" But Cain had one last card to play. He reached for a detonator in his pocket, a final failsafe to bring the entire facility down. Time seemed to slow. Rachel saw Cain's finger tighten on the trigger. Saw Tao gather himself for a final charge. Saw the modified rhino's mechanical implants sparking with deadly energy. Then she saw something else, a small red dart sprouting from Cain's neck. The detonator fell from nerveless fingers as the tranquilizer took effect. "I figured we might need this," said a familiar voice. The guard from Rachel's first day at the reserve stepped out of the smoke, holding a dart gun. "Been waiting 2 years to do that." "You're with conservation?" Rachel asked, understanding dawning. The guard nodded. "Deep cover. We've been building a case against Cain for years. Never thought it would end quite like this, though." He looked at Tao with newfound respect. "Guess sometimes you need a revolution to get justice." Cain slumped to the ground, consciousness fading. His last sight was of Tao standing over him, not with rage now, but with something like pity. The modified rhino approached its savior, mechanical parts creaking. Despite its artificial enhancements, Rachel could see an essential gentleness in its movements, the same quality she'd first recognized in Tao as a calf. "They'll need rehabilitation," she said. "Both of them. The sanctuary in Botswana has already volunteered," the undercover guard replied. "They've got experience with trauma cases." He paused. "Though I don't think anyone has experience with this." As emergency teams secured the facility and led Cain away, Rachel watched Tao guide his wounded companion toward the surface. The sun was rising fully now, its light revealing the full scope of the night's revolution. The animals of Gala Reserve stood watching, a silent honor guard for their liberators. They had won their freedom, but more importantly, they had proven something extraordinary, that the capacity for justice, for mercy, and for change existed in all living things. Cain had tried to create the perfect hunting trophy. Instead, he had catalyzed an awakening that would ripple through the natural world for generations to come. And leading this new dawn was Tao, the rhino who had learned to fight back, to plan, to lead, and finally, to forgive. 3 weeks after the fall of Ngala Reserve, Rachel stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking the sprawling savanna. The morning air was thick with the scent of wild sage and recent rain, nature's own cleansing ritual washing away the last traces of Cain's regime. Below her, a team of wildlife officials was dismantling the last of the hunting compound's outer fences. The story had exploded across international media. Her photographs and footage had exposed not just the illegal hunting operation, but the deeper tale of animal consciousness and cooperation that had brought it down. Scientists and philosophers were still debating the implications of what had happened here, of creatures displaying not just intelligence, but strategic thinking, emotional complexity, and moral choice. Cain's trial was set for next month, with prosecutors from 7 countries bringing charges. The modified rhino, now named Hope by the sanctuary staff, was responding well to treatment. The crude mechanical augmentations had been carefully removed, and while the physical scars would remain, its spirit was healing. Most remarkably, it had become a surrogate parent to several orphan rhino calves, displaying the same gentle patience that Rachel had once seen in Tao. "Quite a view, isn't it?" a voice said behind her. Dr. Sarah Muchua, head of the Botswana Wildlife Sanctuary, climbed up to join her. "The land remembers its freedom." Rachel nodded, watching a herd of elephants move across the plain. Many were former residents of Ngala Reserve, their tusks bearing the scars of close calls with hunters. But they moved differently now, heads high, trunks raised, no longer afraid. "Have you decided?" Dr. Muchua asked. "About the position?" The sanctuary had offered Rachel a role as head of their new conservation program, focusing on studying and protecting highly intelligent animal populations. The work would be groundbreaking, combining traditional conservation with new understanding of animal consciousness. "I have," Rachel said. "But there's something I need to do first." As if on cue, a familiar shape emerged from the morning mist. Tao moved with the same powerful grace she remembered, but there was a piece to him now that she'd never seen before. The rage that had driven him for so long had been replaced by something deeper: purpose. "The local tribes are already telling stories about him," Dr. Muchua said. "The wise one, they call him. They say he's teaching other animals about humans, which ones can be trusted, which ones mean harm." Rachel smiled, remembering the baby rhinos she'd bottle-fed years ago. "He always was a quick learner." Tao approached their outcrop, accompanied by 2 younger rhinos. One was clearly a calf, still learning the ways of the wild. The other was adolescent, bearing the distinctive markings of the same subspecies as Tao. "Is that?" Rachel asked, hope catching in her throat. Dr. Muchua nodded. "DNA tests confirmed it. She's Tao's sister, probably from one of his mother's later calves. She was rescued from another private reserve last year." She paused. "We think he somehow sensed she was here. That's why he stayed in this region all those years, even with hunters after him." Rachel watched as Tao guided his small family toward the waterhole. Other animals gave him a respectful berth, not out of fear, but recognition. Lions paused their hunting to let him pass. Elephants trumpeted soft greetings. Even the birds seemed to acknowledge his presence, their calls changing rhythm as he moved through their territory. "He's not just surviving anymore," Rachel realized. "He's building something. A new kind of sanctuary," Dr. Muchua agreed. "One where animals protect each other. Where they pass on knowledge." She smiled. "Your research could help us understand how to support this natural evolution instead of fighting it." Rachel thought about the years she'd spent crushed by guilt, believing she'd failed Tao. Now she understood. Everything she'd taught him about trust, about love, about protecting others, had served a greater purpose. His captivity had forged those lessons into something revolutionary, something that would change the relationship between humans and animals forever. "I'll take the position," Rachel said. "But with one condition." She climbed down from the outcrop and walked toward Tao. He watched her approach, his ancient eyes holding wisdom that went beyond human understanding. When she reached him, she placed a hand on his scarred hide, feeling the strong heart beating beneath. "I want to work in the field," she continued. "No labs, no cages. We study them in their world on their terms." She looked back at Dr. Mutua. "And we let them teach us, for a change." The scientist's face broke into a wide smile. "I was hoping you'd say that. We've already started setting up observation posts. The animals seem to understand what they're for. Some have even started using them as meeting points." Rachel wasn't surprised. After all, Tao had spent years watching humans, learning their ways. Now he was teaching others to do the same, but not for revenge, for understanding. A soft sound made her look down. The rhino calf had approached her, its small horn barely more than a bump. Behind it, Tao and his sister stood watchful but relaxed, trusting her with their little one. "Hello, little one," Rachel whispered, kneeling to its level. The calf sniffed her hand, then pressed its warm head against her palm, the same way Tao used to do as a baby. In that moment, she felt the weight of the past finally lift. The guilt, the pain, the years of uncertainty, all of it washed away by the simple truth before her. Tao hadn't needed revenge, not really. What he needed was to show both humans and animals a different way forward. As the sun climbed higher, Rachel sat with her notebook, documenting everything she saw. The way the animals moved, the patterns of their interactions, the complex social bonds that humans had been too blind to see. Tao and his family remained nearby, comfortable with her presence but free, utterly free. In the distance, the last of the hunting compound's walls came down. Birds immediately began nesting in the skeletal remains of the guard towers. Life was reclaiming what had been taken, but in a new way, not through force, but through cooperation. "Ready to begin?" Dr. Mutua called out, setting up her own observation equipment. Rachel looked at Tao, who met her gaze with calm understanding. The baby rhino had fallen asleep in the shade of its aunt, while overhead, an eagle soared in lazy circles, keeping watch. "Yes," Rachel answered, feeling the rightness of it deep in her bones. "I think we all are." The age of merely observing nature was over. The time had come to listen to what it had been trying to tell us all along. And in the heart of the African bush, a new chapter was beginning, not just for a woman and the rhino she had raised, but for all those who shared this wild and wonderful world.